Hey everybody, welcome. Thank you for joining us. We're going to get started. I appreciate everybody joining. I hope everyone is staying safe. My name is Tom Bonnier. I'm the CEO of Target Smart. I know folks are still joining, but we're going to jump right in. We have a great agenda today, and I want to get right into it. This is one of the very few silver linings of the awful situation we find ourselves in with this pandemic. Is the ability to gather so many people together in a situation like this and get so many wonderful speakers. So I appreciate you all coming and joining us today for the next hour and 20 minutes or so. And I appreciate all of our panelists coming as well. We have some great panelists. We're gonna have two excellent panels I'm excited about. So let's see, if folks have questions along the way for the two panels, we're not, just because of time constraints, we could probably stay here all day, but we're not gonna have time to take questions during the panel. But if you have questions, please, you should see a Q&A box. I will be doing a really brief sort of what we know, what we don't know presentation at the end of this. And I'll be taking questions then, and then we'd be happy to offer follow-up as well for folks who have questions. So please, if you have questions, put them in the Q&A box and we'll do our best to get to them. So with that, I'm gonna introduce our first panel. Like I said, I'm super excited and super thankful to this group. They have been working especially hard over the last many months and years leading up to the election last month. And I can say, not knowing their specific situations, though, with a fair amount of certainty, that they're probably still not getting a ton of rest and that their lives are probably still a bit crazy. So I'm especially appreciative of them joining. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna introduce our four panelists one by one. One of my least favorite things about these panels is when the moderator awkwardly reads someone's bio. So what I'm gonna do is just introduce each of them and mention their job role in this past election. And I'm gonna ask them to just tell us, just as a quick sort of introduction, what that job actually entails, what that job means, because DC is a land of titles and sometimes they aren't always clear. And then just maybe a little bit about their background before, what led them to the job, where they're working before they joined the national effort. So we're going to start with Becca Siegel. So Becca served as the Chief Analytics Officer with the Biden campaign. And if Becca, if you don't mind telling us a little bit about what that role entailed and sort of what you were doing before that.
Sure. Thank you for having us. Very exciting to talk to folks out there. So yeah, this is a good question because it's one that my family also wonders the answer to. But I think basically analytics on a presidential campaign is mostly about resource allocation. So really broadly, I like to, and I think there's sort of two parts, but really broadly, it's sort of who we should talk to and how is how I think about it, in a way that maximizes our chances of winning. So that's things like how much to invest in each state, which voters we should deliver each message to and how we reach them, how much we should spend on fundraising versus voter contact, where we should travel. Lots of questions like that about sort of like how to allocate our time and money in a way that will maximize our opportunity to win the election. I will say the other piece that we do on analytics is sort of data implementation and infrastructure. So every piece of data that touches the campaign runs through our team. So whether that is, TV spend or fundraising dollars or a wrong number, all of that sort of has to travel between lots of different places. So our sort of second piece is around sort of implementation and infrastructure of this strategy. So lots of fun data cleaning and processing. We do fundraising projections. We make reports. So a wide spectrum of stuff. I would be remiss if I did not also say we had a team of about 160 folks who are looking for jobs now. So would love to hear about opportunities for them, and we're making sure they all land in the right place. And then just a little bit about me. I've worked in politics for my entire career. So I, unlike some, started actually like as a field organizer, which I think is the best job to start with for anyone who works in politics. And I loved working as a field organizer. I moved into data largely because I just kept going so rogue as an organizer that they were like, maybe you should stop. So I moved into data and have been doing that for many cycles now. Worked on, this was my fourth presidential campaign, and have worked at Blue Labs for many years, worked on the Clinton campaign, and worked on this campaign from day one. So a long journey to get here.
Awesome, thank you. And I look forward to hearing more about sort of how that work continued into this campaign. So our next panelist is Shri Ghosh. She served as the state's analytics director in between the coordinated campaign and the Biden campaign. So Srija, take it away.
Yeah, hi, thanks, Tom. So my role in my team was primarily working with the state data directors in the 17 battleground states that we had across the country. About 100 staff who are a subset of the 160 that are also looking for jobs. And essentially make sure that they had the resources from HQ, from other departments on the campaign that they needed to execute state-specific programs that were informed by national strategy. So just a subset of the things that Becca mentioned, making sure that the voter contact platforms that we had were able to talk to each other. So we had like a very 360 view of what was happening on the ground in order to make better decisions about resource allocation and program. And also like access to and understanding of models that we built and how to implement it. I too got my start as an organizer, was an organizer in 2014, as well as for Hillary Clinton's campaign for the caucus. I also moved into data for many of the same reasons Becca did, and ended up working in Pennsylvania in 2018, our favorite state, Pennsylvania, as the data director there before joining the Biden campaign in May of 2019.
Thank you. Yeah, and it helps to win, I'm sure, in terms of, not that you would have felt worse about Pennsylvania, but I'm sure it helped to win. All right, so our next two panelists actually share a title as sort of co-directors as national campaign directors with the coordinated campaign, again, sort of between the DNC and the Biden campaign and the state parties. So first, Kristen Avery.
Hey there, that's exactly right. Ramsey and I are two sides of the same coin. As coordinated campaign directors, I really oversaw both the Southern and the West states for the campaign on the side. And basically what that entails is with our partners on the ground, including the states, and setting up the infrastructure on the ground, doing a lot of the hiring, and then really running point on the program along with the coordinated director of every single state. So we also have a lot of folks looking for jobs right now, so let us know. I'll turn over to, and before this, I started as an organizer, similar to everyone else, for the Obama campaign in 2007, and then have worked in government advocacy campaigns ever since.
Hey everyone, my name is Ramsey Reed. I think that you know, while our roles were national coordinated campaign directors, I really think it was much more Becca and Srija's personal assistants. Once they sort of figure out what we should be doing, we try and do it. Like everyone else, my first job was as a field organizer for Barack Obama, and I've worked on campaigns and progressive causes ever since. You know, the more senior I've gotten, the more I've found that it's a lot of HR and ops, but you know, work really closely managing the coordinated campaigns in Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and had a really, you know, and I think hopefully we'll get to talk about this, a really fascinating experience trying to you know, pivot our campaign tactics to operate during a pandemic, which is a unique challenge.
Yeah, thank you, Ramsey. I do want to get into that, and I think that'll be the second question I ask. What I want to get into, a lot of these questions I'm just going to throw out as toss-ups, but even though I think, you know, in the heat of the election year, we see the most attention paid, there's a lot of work that goes on behind the scenes in the years leading up in terms of the preparation work, a lot of the foundational work with data and technology, that sort of sets the groundwork for the results. So I'd love to hear, in terms of, you know, we heard a lot of the stories about coming out of 2016 and sort of identifying some areas where we needed to improve as a party. if y'all could talk about the sort of foundational work, either in that sort of infrastructure or the organizing. I'll start with Becca, just in terms of sort of talking about the data infrastructure, anything that was happening from that point forward. And then the rest of you can jump in terms of the sort of organizing and investments that were happening prior to this year.
Yeah, I'm excited to talk about this because I think it's not often mentioned, but like very foundational to anything useful we do is the infrastructure that underlies that, and the quality of the data that we are using is really 90% of any good decision we make. And then maybe like the little bit on top is any innovation or implementation we bring to it, but really having a solid foundation is so important. I think this is the case in data science broadly, and people just don't like to talk about it, but like, you know, so much of what we do is really simple data science on top of really good data. And I think that is so foundational. We spend a lot of time thinking about that and working on that. So what the DNC has been able to do, and we've witnessed it for those of us who have been doing this for many cycles, is really astounding in the last 4 years. I think the investments are very clear, both from a like infrastructure standpoint, things are very, very stable and secure now, which is great. But also from just a data quality standpoint, you know, there is much more robust and easier to use historical data, things like education models. Like that is hugely important to how we approach voter contact, especially this cycle. I mean, and every cycle, but of course that is emerging as a real key piece in any sort of democratic voter targeting. So that sort of historic data, phones data, historic contact data, all of the infrastructure improvements, all of this has allowed us to basically start like on second base when we sort of start these campaigns. So I think it's just, you know, there's so much that team did over the last 4 years that allowed us to get a head start on where we are. I think the other thing to just mention briefly is investments in the Democratic Data Exchange were super helpful. We used that very widely, and in many cases that was our only source of certain kinds of data. For example, in states where you cannot get the list of who has requested a ballot, that was one of the only ways we could sort of learn that data from some of our soft side partners. So that's been hugely helpful. And then I would finally just say, you know, the team that the DNC has built to support this infrastructure is also super strong. And they were great partners to us, and we partnered every step of the way. They, I want to just also note, are led across the board by women. So there were many meetings we had talking about data in the Democratic Party that were just 100% women, which has not always been the case as well. Sometimes I would be in a meeting with like only men and be like, what is going on here? So that was great. And, you know, I think we are also just looking forward to continuing to work with that team in the years to come, making sure that, you know, we want to leave this infrastructure better than we found it. So there's a lot that we built because of the scale of the campaign that we want to make sure, you know, carries on. So it was just a great experience, I think, compared to where we've been in the past, just hugely helpful to what we were able to do.
Thank you. And so, and to the rest of the panelists, in terms of taking what was sort of built there and the organizing work, can anyone speak to the sort of work in terms of identifying the states, in working with state parties, organizations on the ground, and putting that investment in the off year, and that sort of work that happened?
Yeah, before we started on the campaign in the general election, we have actually had the pleasure of being at the DNC since 2017 and kind of getting to work on the rebuild overall. And, you know, I think our perspective on the pre-general election infrastructure was that, number one, there was a lot of uncertainty. Number two, presidential re-elects have increasingly had, you know, tipping point states that are proximate, that are similarly proximate as their re-elect. So knowing that, try and put together a broad map of infrastructure that would allow whoever won the nomination to scale in the places that were the right fit when we were within 4 or 5 months of election day. And so, you know, in 2019, launched a program called Organizing Corps that was in 7 states, including the Blue Wall states, Georgia, Arizona, North Carolina, and Florida. And, you know, I think we can all put ourselves back in a couple of years ago, there was a lot of angst about this or that, one path or the other. And, you know, I think from a pre-general election standpoint, our view was always it wasn't the DNC's role to pick a pathway, but to create multiple pathways and to prepare the kind of infrastructure that would allow efficient resource allocation later, which is exactly what Becca and Shrija did really well.
That's great. Ramsey, I have to compliment you on the very cinematic lighting scheme you have going on now too.
Sorry, the sunset, I'm in Rhode Island and the sun sets at like 4 o'clock here. So I'm enjoying a nice sunset on this panel.
It'll be right in your eyes in a few minutes, I think. So, well, let's pivot if we can, and we can also sort of jump back to this question in terms of the preparation, because I think the two go together. But obviously the pandemic was the defining factor in many ways of this campaign, one that no one anticipated. But I think back to March 13th when the country went largely into lockdown. You know, those of us who work with the data and think about, well, we've got to put turnout projections out there and things like that, start to think of how is this going to impact things? And there's a million different ways to argue it. We look at the first state that had a primary election in the pandemic, which I believe was Ohio, and it was entirely by mail. And I think turnout was about 10%. And there was a question about what does this mean? We had a lot of intensity, a lot of enthusiasm, and more investment in organizing this campaign than ever before, but a question about what it would mean in terms of running a campaign. And so this is a broad question because I know it impacts all of you differently, and you likely dealt with this in different ways. But I'd love to hear from each of you in terms of that moment and what changed for you beyond the obvious sort of literal, but we can talk about that too in terms of not going into the office anymore. But what changed in terms of your planning, your preparation, and the work you had to do from that point on. So why don't we start with Kristen, and then we'll just go around through the group.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the timing was a little funny because, you know, when Biden got the nomination, pretty much synced up with the beginning of the pandemic. So it was the time that we were scaling the program anyway in all of the states. And I think, you know, a lot of the obvious things needed to happen. We needed to make sure that everybody had a Zoom account. Everybody was trained on how to use it. But I think the other piece on this is, you know, we always knew distributed organizing and digital organizing was going to be a very big part of whatever campaign was run in a general election. That obviously became an even larger part of the campaign when the national pandemic started. But at the heart of it all, like, an organizing is between a relationship with the organizer and their volunteer, and a volunteer and the voter. So we just kept that as the core focus of the programming. We just changed the tools and tactics we did to facilitate those conversations.
That's awesome. Shrija, from an analytics perspective and the work you were doing at the state level, how did things change at that point? How did your work change? How did the focus change?
Yeah, so as Kristen said, at that point, we were planning for a national distributed program regardless of pandemic. So with that brought a lot of capacity from non-battleground states into battleground states to the point where it could be considered unlimited. So kind of what was the best way to use that unlimited capacity? What is the best platform to reach a voter were things we had to learn new. It was the same organizing, just different tactics. We couldn't, you know, we had to find new ways to reach them. And then we, you know, ask ourselves the questions like, is there such thing as too much voter outreach? Obviously, the first time you attempt a voter is the best voter contact. But as you talk to them, as you attempt them several times, you do get diminishing margins of return. So, you know, how many times is too many times? And then ultimately, because we had so much voter outreach, because we were able to talk to so many voters over 2016 and past cycles, how did that affect and how did that have inputs into our modeling and research? And those were all questions that we were kind of asking ourselves going into the first couple of months.
So that's fascinating. It makes me think, if I can pivot the question a little bit as we go to Becca next, because I've thought about this a lot, and this is, y'all are going to defer because I know this is a very compliments here. And I've said this before, but when you think about the judge of a campaign and organizers, it's hard to know the impact we have, right? Because there's no perfect vacuum where there was no campaign that happened to compare to. There's no control group. But what we generally look to is they say the best coaches win the close games. Well, the same can be said of campaigns, right? Because it takes that effort. And you look at, I believe there were 7 states that were decided by about 2 points or less. I mean, there were a bunch of states that were decided by thousands of votes or less. And y'all won 6 of those 7. And to be able to do that, number one, you have to have a good sense of which states those are going to be to allocate those resources to. But then 2, you have to have a sense of who the right voters are and everything you said in terms of making those sorts of pivots to target the right voters in the right way. So Becca, again, it's a broad question to you, but in terms of when the pandemic comes in and these challenges are put in front of you, how does that sort of work of just defining, because you, in your introduction, you talked about your job is largely defining where the resources go. How did that change and what did that look like?
Yeah, I mean, I think, and people will laugh because I would say the word I used the most on this campaign was uncertainty. And I think when we were in March, we should always be more uncertain. If we learn one thing ever, we should always be more uncertain. But in March, I mean, I think the whole world was very uncertain, and specific to the election, you know, there was so much we couldn't anticipate at that time. Like, you know, some of it was how big will this campaign be? Like that was a big question to answer in March, because we had no idea what the economy would look like. We had no idea what fundraising would look like. But the other question was like, how will people vote? And we were getting very confounding messages from those primary contests that happened very early. We saw things like really high rejection rates. We saw low returns on mail ballots that like didn't get sent in time. I mean, there was just a lot of election administration that was sort of concerning to watch. So I think there were sort of 2 things that were like, I think there were sort of 2 paths. One was like, we just should be more uncertain. And I will come back to that, because I think when we were approaching what states to target, I think the thing that we did well, it's not that we necessarily, you know, have fixed polling. I think we're a long way from fixing polling. We don't need to go into that here, but, you know, I think it was important to think through a strategy that would be resilient to errors in polling and that built in that kind of uncertainty, especially around like whether or not people would vote or vote in high numbers or low numbers and by various methods. And so I think that was always our operating theory, was like, imagine a world where things go awry. That was like, I like sort of was the perpetual pessimist in many ways on this campaign, because that's, I think, a robust strategy when you are running a presidential campaign and polls show you ahead. You should always be very, very, very pessimistic. That's like, you are creating a strategy for an election that is close. That's the difference between a presidential strategy and, say, a strategy to win as many House seats as possible. Those are 2, they will be in conflict in certain ways, because in a presidential strategy, you are trying to maximize your chances of reaching 270 electoral votes. Whereas if you were trying to win as many seats as possible, you're looking for the closest races. For us, we are looking for the closest races in a scenario where the election itself is very close. That's what we were always planning around. And eventually what we got to there was sort of like a scenario that took us to those blue wall states, which in polling looked like the strongest, safest approach. But then we said to ourselves, but there is uncertainty for many reasons here. Uncertainty because of COVID, uncertainty because of the economy, uncertainty because of polling error, uncertainty because of our Republicans answering the phone right now, you know, lots of uncertainty. And so that is why we sort of said to ourselves, okay, well, there's this one strategy, but like, in what ways could that be wrong? In what ways could this go wrong such that we would lose? And that leads us to investments in places like Georgia and places like Arizona, which have just very different types of voters from those blue wall states, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. So that's sort of like our approach. And I think how COVID fits into that was just that we took very, very, very little for granted at any time.
I would say, I'll jump in here. I mean, the other piece that I think is really interesting and unique to this election was within a state. I mean, sort of setting aside the like resource allocations across states, once you think that a state is likely to be proximate to the tipping point and you have a program that can impact the outcome in it, what are you actually doing? And I think that was a really fascinating puzzle to unlock. And I remember being in a meeting where Becca just, and at this time, I think nationally and particularly among the sort of like, I don't want to call it the like elite class, but like the political chattering class was very much still thinking about like spring Democratic primaries and like almost exclusive vote by mail. And Becca and Shrija saying there are really good targets who are only going to vote in person on election day, and we have got to get them out. There are really good targets who are definitely going to be voting by mail, who may not complete the process well. And there are people who are going to vote early if we push them to. And it added this additional wrinkle and layer, and multiple layers in many cases, of vote method shifting and the mix of the type of programs that you're running within states. And I think that was a really, really important part of success, not just thinking about resource allocation across states, but how you actually run the program to get the most out of it, knowing that you have to give a special treatment to each individual voter based on the best chance of them completing their vote for you.
Yeah, I remember thinking it sometimes wistfully. I'm like, remember when we could just GOTV people? Like, we were never doing that this cycle. It was always like very, very tailored to what is the vote method? What are the laws in that state? What is the optimal timing for that state for those laws? What do we need to tell them? Are they likely to be able to complete this process or not? Do we need to make sure that they have a witness? Like, just the layers of targeting and complication this year were, I think, just much broader than we were imagining going in.
The complexity is literally mind-blowing. And I appreciate, thank you for sort of embracing the uncertainty. I think for those of us who work in data, there's been too much sort of this guru approach that if we admit any level of uncertainty, we're somehow not doing our job, when I agree with you entirely. It's we're not doing our job if we aren't acknowledging that there is uncertainty. So unfortunately, we're just about at the end. I would love to just pivot real quickly, if I can ask Kristen and Shrija to weigh in on this, because thinking about all these things that changed, I'd love your take just sort of on looking forward. And I'm not asking you to give us a definitive answer, even necessarily prognosticate, but what carries forward? And this is not so much about the pandemic, but in terms of things that you did that worked, that were different, and what maybe do you hope doesn't carry forward from the sort of pandemic campaign that you all endured? And Kristen, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, we really did make a lot of innovations, and this has really been happening over the last decade. I think the pandemic did speed up some of it around relational organizing and digital organizing, and really making sure that that's integrated into the day-to-day programs in states. And that is definitely something that I hope continues. I know it will continue as we continue to evolve, because campaigns should meet the times that they're running in. Things that I hope don't, that much time on Zoom. I will say a lot of us were on Zoom from 6 a.m. to midnight, and that is just too much time. So that's definitely one thing. And then, of course, the in-person interactions between colleagues is also very important, and we hope to get that back in future cycles.
Well, thank you for doing one more Zoom with us today. Shrija, what do you think?
Yeah, I think one of our, as Becca and Ramsey spoke to really well, one of our best successes was like meeting voters where they are, having voter education plans based on exactly how they were thinking about voting in their state, unique to their situation. So hopefully we can take some of our approach to voters and translate that into volunteers, reaching out to volunteers, making sure we're engaging with them on the platforms that they are most comfortable with, whether it's in person, whether it's online, whether it's a hybrid of both, and making sure that we continue to grow what I think was a really, really robust volunteer base that we activated this past cycle.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you all so much. I wish we had more time for folks who have questions. As I said at the outset, if you have questions for this group, again, unfortunately, we don't have time for a Q&A now, but if you put them in the question box, we'll do our best to get them in front of them. I know they are very busy. Some of them are in the process of moving at this moment, as people in the campaign world do. For joining us. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Tom.
All right, so we're going to jump right into our next panel, which I'm excited about. And I'm going to turn it over to Reed Wilson from The Hill, who has been kind enough to join us and moderate this panel. Reed, take it away.
All right. Thanks, Tom. And good talk in the first panel there. I don't want to spend too much time introducing everybody, so I'm just going to run through real quick who we've got today. 4 experts in the polling field: Ben Lazarus, Director of Research Solutions at Target Smart; Carlos Odio, the co-founder of Equus Research; Margie O'Maro, the principal at GB; and Jane Rayburn, the Vice President at EMC Research. So welcome, everybody. An early narrative that got set pretty much the moment the polls closed the polls were wrong, right? This is the thing that we go back to every single year, but of course that's overly simplistic. So I wanted to start a little more broadly. Should we be saying that those polls were actually wrong? And Jane, I want to start with you. You had a good point on this earlier.
Yeah, thank you, and thanks for having me, and we're excited to be here. To answer your question, I think, we just don't know the answer yet. I know that's a kick the can pollster answer that's frustrating lots of folks right now, but certainly we're eager to really get the rest of the data in. I mean, we're still counting votes in some places like New York, for example, and to really be able to look at, where we ended and where the polls were and where the final results were, I think is really important. I think that there's quite a bit of information to unpack as far as media-based polling, public polling for consumption, and internal electoral campaign focused polling. A lot of the work that we do early on is meant to be a roadmap for decision making, like Becca was talking about. I was really excited and interested to listen to that other panel. We want to move the needle, right? If the internal polling that we're doing in July is the same as November, then it means that campaigns don't matter. And I'm not totally willing to cede that yet. But as far as everything that's been public, and particularly late polls coming in, I think we're still waiting to see where we land, to get all of the data uploaded, to do things like matching it back, see who voted, how they voted, and really going from there before, I'm willing to say that writ large.
Any of the other 3 of you want to jump in on that?
Yeah, this is Ben. Hey, everybody. I think Jane's absolutely right. With the jury's still out in a lot of regards, but I think we've got to take a really hard look at what the narrative is and recognize that there's certainly some truth to it, right? I think from the work that my team did and that we saw a lot publicly is that in general the polls were pretty good at predicting the percentage of the vote that a Democrat was going to get in a lot of places at a lot of different levels of the ballot, and that maybe the polls weren't quite as good at predicting the percentage of the vote that a Republican was going to get. And that seems to be a pretty consistent trend that we've just kind of seen everywhere. And so to me, that suggests that there was probably something wrong, right? Like exactly what was wrong, I think we definitely need to get all of the data back to make some better determinations. If it's an error in not capturing the right people who actually voted, so understanding who voted and were we predicting the right nature of the electorate vis-a-vis partisanship and education and gender and age and where voters were coming from in different parts of the country or a congressional district or a state legislative district, but also just is there some kind of pattern to who won't take our surveys, right? And someone on the last panel I think it was Becca, alluded to it, are Republicans just not answering the phone? And I think, the breadth of the outcomes suggest that certainly there is some segment of Republicans who probably aren't answering the phone. And exactly how many there are and exactly who those folks are, I think is definitely still to be determined. And then can we correct for it is also still to be determined. How do we correct for it? I think these are the kind of big questions, but I do think we need to, as we move forward from 2020, something was missed, right? How much we could have possibly solved for that ahead of time, I'm not sure, right? And that's stuff that we're certainly grappling with.
I think we had, I'll be brief, there's an emotional connection, emotional investment that people seem to have to the idea of the polls being wrong. And it depends a little bit on what is happening on Tuesday night versus later on, right? And you saw that in 2018 where early calls in Georgia and Florida, really drove people's views about the polls that actually weren't borne out when all the data came in. And you saw a little bit of that on Tuesday night when you had states still not called at the presidential level, leading people to say, the polls were wrong. At the same time, looking at all the races beneath the surface, you saw that there were clear expectations were set, in a direction across the board, and not just by public polls in states, but also the resource allocation decisions that campaigns made, that committees made, that folks made beneath the surface suggests that lots of people were, had similar information. And I think that's part of what the next steps in internal conversations are going to explore, some of that.
So on the presidential level, the polls were pretty substantially within the margin of error, and Jane made the good point that that the polls sort of nailed Biden where Biden stood and maybe missed some Trump voters. But in some state and district specific cases, there were some pretty substantial misses. And it wasn't just the media polls or the Democratic polls. I mean, my Republican sources were ready to walk off a cliff in early October. Is there a difference then between the way you're polling, the results we saw from those presidential levels and from, say, Senate races, House races, and on down the ballot? Margie, let's start with you if you don't mind.
Yeah, I mean, I think, we're going to see as the voter file gets matched and we look, and look at people who are confirmed voters. And, I think there are a variety of theories that we're going to look into. I don't think it's simply about Trump. I mean, for once, it's not just about Trump, right? There's going to be a variety of things at play here. And given the fact that every outlet, maybe they use the same, they use some of the same techniques, but you have some people who do more text to web. You have some folks who are doing more exclusively landline. I'm old enough to remember when we did 100% landline calls. Nobody does that anymore. But people, there seems to be something that happens at the data collection point, that the folks who get into your survey, since people are doing, a variety of different things and ultimately end up in sort of with a similar national aggregate trend in terms of what was off and what was not off. And also, of course, it wasn't off in every state equally. There were some places where the polling was more off, like Maine, and then there were some states where the polling was less off, like Georgia. So there were, and that was consistent across different outlets. So there's something else happening. I don't think it's simply like one, if one pollster had pressed this button at this point, instead of that point, we would have had a different result. There's something earlier in the process that was really affecting everybody. And if it was simply about Trump, then you might not have seen it happening down ballot races. It would be something that you would see more about at the presidential level. Certainly, it suggests that the kind of shy Trump, deliberately lying to an interviewer on the phone. If that was the case, then you would see less error down ballot than at the top of the ticket. Yeah,
and Carlos, I want to bring you in here on that too. Specifically, the sort of differences we saw in the Hispanic community, and I wonder how much you're seeing sort of a demographic challenge in recruiting the right people for your polls.
Yeah, I mean, obviously the narrative around the Latino vote has been fairly complicated and in many ways was shaded by where election night started in Miami-Dade. And so this is a polling conversation. I think we can have an honest conversation about the fact Trump did make inroads with Latino vote, not to the extent I think some of the press narratives have made it out, but it was pretty consistent. The question is, did the polling catch it? And part of the question is, which polling are we talking about? I think part of the problem is we're looking a lot to public polls statewide in a place like Florida, where you're interviews with 100 Latinos. And yes, you are going to miss a shift among foreign-born Cuban Americans who've immigrated since 1995, even though that was a tremendous and significant shift that was responsible for a big piece of what you saw in Miami-Dade County. But the polling that was specific to these subgroups, where you had ample sample size, where the methodology was sort of specific to the audience, you did see some of it. Not that we saw all of it. I want to be clear about that, right? There are still some of the challenges you see with polling writ large, whether it's non-response bias, whatever it might be, is also clearly playing out on the Latino front. I just think we have a challenge at a subgroup level, right? Like so much of what's happening in the electorate right now is at the margins. the way Republicans go after the Latino vote is a margins game. They're trying to shave off 1,000 votes here, 1,000 votes there. That's harder to pick up in polling when some of the groups they're targeting, like Colombians or Venezuelans, you're rarely going to have enough interviews in your sample to really pick up on that kind of movement. So I think there are a variety of challenges, both in the differences in polling and then also in how the media is digesting the polling that is there and evaluating its efficacy for at a subgroup level.
So you all, as you're doing your work, you're not just doing the quantitative, 1,000-person samples, but also the qualitative sort of focus group diving in here. Not a lot of focus groups in the middle of a pandemic, or maybe you're doing them all on Zoom or however that works. How did that change your approach to this particular campaign? Margie, I know you do a ton of focus groups, so you want to take that first?
Yeah, I mean, I miss focus group respondents. Like I miss doing focus groups. I don't miss the getting up early for the flight the next day, but I miss doing them. So we've tried a variety of different kinds of methodologies that, we had done some of before, but really to just, fully flesh out our repertoire of different kinds of qualitative methodologies. And so that could be telephone IDIs, because not everybody is, has a strong Wi-Fi with Zoom, at the ready. We've done lots of Zoom focus groups. We've done qual boards, which is a, bulletin board where people can kind of type their answer at their convenience. We've done qual boards followed by video IDIs or one-on-one interviews. So we've done a variety of these things. And still, I think the Zoom focus group is closest to what, to an in-person focus group. Like you get to have a rapport and see how people, respond, push them and interact with them and follow up with them at the ready in a way that is harder with some of the other methodologies. At least that's my preference. Other folks have it, but it has some advantages in that you can reach people anywhere around the country or anywhere in a state in one session rather than picking a market and flying there. At the same time, you are missing the truly in-person contact that comes from an in-person focus group where people, they connect. They connect. They sit at a table, they share food, they share drink, they, talk with each other about their families. Maybe they've already, started a chat in the waiting room before they come in. And that really is a special thing that I guess I really miss. And so I don't know if we had missed things that if we had done more of them, more in person, if we had that ability, we would have heard something different. I don't know if that really changes, polling error in a down ballot race somewhere. I don't know if that's the case, but it's something that we lost a little bit of. It is something that, that we didn't do as much of for obvious reasons. And it's just one of the many things we've missed out on a little bit in 2020.
So a lot of states also made changes to their ballot access laws during the pandemic crisis. An unprecedented number of absentee ballots, vote by mail. I mean, New York is probably still counting their primary election by now. Even in states like New York, where these were rarely used. Jane, how did that make your job tougher as you're sort of concentrating on this polling universe?
Definitely, great question. I think there's a lot of different reasons, but most importantly, democracy access is good, and I'm glad that there is more of it, period, right? So I think what we're still trying to unpack is how did people vote? Did the way that they indicated they would vote match up with the way that they actually executed their vote? And I really think that this is regionally specific, namely because the state laws have so much to do with the way that people are actually able to cast their ballot. In some places, you see that the state laws didn't catch up with democracy access initiatives that were put into place because of the pandemic. So, I think people were unfamiliar, perhaps optimistic in their indication of how they would vote, but also that they would vote. I believe one of the other panelists on the previous panel said, we had some really good targets that would vote by mail, but we had to go chase them, right? And so I think as pollsters, we're not doing that persuasion or that ballot chase or that GOTV, but we are trying to, look and segment the electorate for the way that people are going to vote and not overrepresent one vote method. And that's really challenging when you don't have this, but in other places like Florida, that has had a robust vote by mail and early vote system. We were able to sort of gauge that a little bit better, but people's voting behaviors changed pretty substantially. Vote method was more partisan than ever this year, at least in terms of how voters indicated that they would vote, with Democrats saying that they would vote absentee and by mail, and Republicans saying that they would vote in person. So that was something, and again, not to sound like a broken record, but I'm eager to, look at the voter file once we get it and see, how people actually ended up voting. But I do think that was a challenge, because we just didn't have a full picture of knowing, I'm thinking about some local stuff that we did in Georgia. People really suppressed their tendency to say that they would vote early in person, and these two places that I'm thinking of, it was a strong majority of folks who actually voted early in person compared to something like 30% in the poll. So when you're trying to get that right proportionally, I think that it can really be a challenge, and so certainly there are a lot of lessons to take away from that, and things that we'll be able to learn even more from once we have more information.
Ben, we were all clicking refresh on the Target Early website in the last weeks before the election. Do you want to address that, sort of the wave of early voters?
Well, yeah, I actually think this is one of the success stories of polling in 2020. I think the polling generally did a pretty good job at picking up what Jane just referenced, which was this kind of partisan polarization for how you're going to vote, right? And I think there were plenty of reasons to explain why that happened, but I think the polls did a pretty good job pretty early on picking up that Democrats were really chomping at the bit to vote by mail, and that Donald Trump was pretty successfully demonizing vote by mail for his co-partisans, freaking them out about it, and making it sound like it was dirty and corrupt and bad, right? And so I think the polling did a really good job at showing that being the path moving forward. And I think that did help inform a lot of campaigns in terms of their tactics, right? And really leaning into vote by mail and understanding that was the core organizing tactic for turning Democrats out, obviously depending on the state and the rules. But I actually think that there was a pretty high level of accuracy around that, particularly, again, because I think in general, the polling did a pretty good job at picking up on sentiments of Democrats this cycle. But we also saw, that there was very likely to be this kind of avalanche of Republican support on election day. And, Reed, the Target Early stuff was showing us that things were looking pretty good. But again, one of the big kind of existential challenges that we face is predicting who's going to vote, right? And that and kind of projecting out what the electorate's going to look like is always one of the hardest things any of us as pollsters can do. It's equal parts empiricism and analysis and feel and emotion, right? And it's a kind of delicate balancing act. And so what we certainly saw was this massive surge of Republican vote on election day that counteracted a lot of the early vote. And we could predict that the folks who were coming out were going to be pretty Republican. It was much harder for us to really predict granularly how many of them were going to actually come out on election day. And I think we were all a bit surprised by just how many people voted in this election, even though we all knew it was going to be a high turnout election from the get-go. It was still just massive in terms of where the expectations were.
So Carlos, let's go to you. You see a ton of polling come in. How did different Democratic pollsters handle that very question that Ben just addressed, the sort of anticipating the size of the turnout surge?
Yeah, and we work with Ben and we work with Jane and we work with Margie's firm. So we're working with great pollsters who are anticipating as just as you said. I mean, I think part of the challenge you saw in a place like, let's say, Nevada, where I think there were a lot of assumptions that Nevada was going to be a safer state. Every eligible voter, registered voter in Nevada was going to receive a ballot in the mail for the first time. There's a state where you didn't have a history of mail voting, and you also weren't going to have the same on-the-ground operations to follow up with that ballot chase. So when we saw in the polling the extent to which people were still saying that they were going to vote on election day or they weren't going to vote by mail, and the possibilities for confusion, I think part of what the polling was able to do is tease out where there were targets that needed follow-up for more education, the need for education. And then, I think in general, the polling showed the turnout surge. I think one of the questions that we're going to have to go back at now is look at the turnout differential. Part of the story in Latino vote is the extent to which the Trump vote surged just to a much higher degree than the Democratic Democratic vote. It's less a story of vote switching, former Democrats going Republican, and more about Trump somehow managing to turn out a Latino voter who I think was a little bit more off our radar. And I think as we go back into the polling, I think a big question will be, who was that? Were they in our polling and we just didn't notice because we were looking at the big picture?
So Margie and Jane, along those lines, are you going to change the way, you're going to change your voter screens in the future, or how do you address sort of those voter screen questions?
I mean, we, you know, like everybody else in the industry, we made adjustments after 16. You know, someone in my office did, you know, a 7-page PowerPoint about how you ask educational attainment. You know, we had, I mean, the reason I was a little late is we had our sort of end of year meeting where we spent, you know, an hour talking about what's the right way to ask about, you know, news consumption or religion or, you know, or gender, or which somebody had a question about in the chat, which I answered. So, you know, this is something we spend a lot of time reflecting on, even when the polling is, you know, nationally has no error. We still spend a lot of time thinking about it because it's important. It's important to get these right and have them standardized. And I think a lot of folks in the industry want to find the right answer, right? To Ben's point, you know, this question of who's going to vote and how do you figure that out? It's a universe that doesn't exist yet, right? It's not that the answer is out there and, you know, just keep looking and you'll get the right answer. It's a thing that doesn't exist. So you are, you know, people themselves may not know if they're going to vote. So you are, you know, you're asking people to report on something that they aren't for sure certain about yet necessarily either. So all of that is part of making sure you have not just the right composition, you're asking people questions in the right ways, that their answer categories are clear and complete. And it's something that, you know, we constantly need readjusting as our own terms and definitions and language change.
Yeah, just to piggyback off Margie's answer, which I really agree with wholeheartedly. I think we're always looking at the way that we ask questions, screens, demographics, the way that we weight and project. The other thing that we took a big inventory of and will do again this year is the way by which we contact voters. I think that methodology matters. Margie said at the beginning of this call, you know, nobody's making all landline calls anymore. That is true because we as an industry have evolved. And I think this year we started implementing, and in some places very heavily implemented or had been doing for years, like mixed mode and multimodal contact with voters. And I think even thinking about some of the areas that we researched, you know, we saw major discrepancies in vote by mode, whether that was on a cell phone, live call, live interview versus a text to web. Of the exact same survey, you know, just large discrepancies when you looked at the data as a whole. So I think still unpacking that and making sure that we're reaching people in the right way is really important, and in a way where, you know, Ben has touched on this a lot, and I do agree with him. And, you know, I think that proportionally we had the right, perhaps the right number of Republicans in the sample, but not the right type of Republicans. And I think it's really important to figure out, how do we get folks to, by the mode by which we contact them, to, you know, respond, not just respond. Honestly, I agree with Margie that I don't totally subscribe to the shy Trumper theory, but I do think that there, if you don't reach out to the person, they can't participate, right? And so we want to make sure that our sampling is inclusive and that our methodology reaches all of the right people and is distributed in a way that gets us the right mix of folks to respond.
I mean, just to jump in there really quick. I mean, I think like that's absolutely right. The one thing we have to, I really think, start to grapple with and figure out is like, if there's a very decent chance that these folks just won't take a survey, right? I mean, we're seeing survey response rates continue to kind of slowly, inexorably go down, right? And our big picture fear as pollsters is that there will become some pattern in that non-response, that there will be some people who behave differently, and also as a correlate to that, don't take surveys. And so like, if we throw every single possible way of trying to get them to take our survey, whether it's a text to web or an email, or we call them or we knock on their door or whatever, like every possible way to try and get to them, but they're still not survey responsive, what do we do then, right? And I think that's the big next step question, is like, how do we think about adjusting for an era of non-response when misinformation continues to be on the rise, where Republican partisans are queuing in to cues and signals that they're not supposed to take part in our research from the very top, right? And so if that continues to be a trend and only gets exacerbated, I think we can only expect for this problem to continue if we don't try and address it. And so I think we do have to kind of take it head on and figure out, okay, how do we, if we can't get them to take our survey, okay, how do we adjust for that? How do we measure that? How do we figure out like approximately how many of them there are and like figure out surrogates for their attitudes in our research to make sure that we're not like fundamentally missing some segment of the electorate that's just kind of like turned off from doing survey research.
All right, we're getting close to the top of the hour, so I want to make this one sort of our wrap up for all of you. And Margie, I know you've got a heart out, so let's start with you. Everyone is in the process of these post-election autopsies, but are there any early lessons that you've already drawn that you're going to carry forward to your next round of polling? And were there any groups, aside from those sort of anxious Republicans that Ben just mentioned, who weren't sampled enough?
I think we're going to be here are a couple of things that we're going to be looking at. I think one would be, are we going to, more consistently ask people about their previous vote, which is, is something that pollsters do. I don't know if that's uniform across everybody throughout the whole industry, public and Republican, Democrat, et cetera. So is that a metric that's important for us to keep track of? Are we going to be asking people about their vote method? Perhaps that's something we should be doing as well. So we can, ask people how they voted. I mean, when I say vote method last time, how did they vote last time? Did they vote in person? Did they vote by mail? What did they do? That may be important too. What we've continued to do and will continue to do going forward is look at breakoffs, right? We look at the demographic characteristics of the people who terminate the survey midway through. They could terminate, in question 3, they could terminate on question 83. But that doesn't help us look at the people who were not in the sample and how those folks are different. But that's something that we'll continue to do. It's essential that folks do that. We'll continue to look at education in a very thoughtful, careful way, and not just education overall, but education within audience, education among white voters, education among white men, education among white women, looking at that more carefully. Should we all be consistently looking at ideology in a certain way? Is that something that we need to be thinking closely about how we talk about it, how we ask about it, the words that we use, liberal versus progressive or intensity and so on. Those things may make a difference. Some of these other kinds of metrics like social trust and some of these other dimensions, how people view kind of the broader climate, are going to be difficult to know. Well, what should it look like in this district? It's going to be hard to know what is the distribution of social trust in this congressional district. I think that's going to be a challenge. We're going to need to, I think, start with some of these demographics that we have counts for that transcend around the country, and before we think about are there other attitudinal kinds of measures that we want to make sure that we keep tabs on too. And so we're always having, some kind of internal benchmark of some of these other views.
Gotcha. Carlos, let's go to you. What are the early lessons that you've learned?
Yeah, really, we're asking so many questions because there's still not enough answers. I think one thing is, look, a lot of these challenges are not going to improve, right? Non-response is not going to low response rates are not going to get better. More people aren't going to start answering their phones. And so part of this is also just how do we change the way we're interpreting and presenting all of this data? I think normalizing having multiple scenarios coming out of a poll, we're so eager to have one top line number that we're all focused on, but instead modeling different possibilities based on what we're seeing in the polling. What happens when you get a more Democratic electorate? What happens if the white vote regresses to the mean? We did a little bit of that in terms of simulating the vote in certain states. What happens if white voters are lying or if we're not capturing it properly? And so I think we're going to have to find other workarounds around polling that are not just specific to the methodology in the polling.
All right, Jane?
Definitely, I think I would echo what Margie and Carlos already said, so perhaps this isn't particularly remarkable, but I would lift up the point about ideology. I think that's probably the most important going forward, and I already soapboxed just a little bit about making sure that we're thinking critically about mode as we approach each district. You know, I think we can't treat all districts equal. What works in Miami-Dade might not work in rural North Carolina, might not work in Massachusetts. So continuing to look at the dynamics and the unique nature of every district, and that includes the candidates, the electorate, what they look like. You know, of course, we can, Margie really outlined a lot of like the guts of the poll, but looking externally at who we're trying to poll, I think is a top lesson. There's really no one size fits all approach. So definitely continuing to integrate that and being innovative in the way that we poll, I think is really the most important thing going into, you know, elections start now, right? We have municipals on deck here for a couple months away. So definitely trying those things. And then also within the poll itself, just making sure that we're asking head-to-head questions in a variety of ways, I think will be really important. Seeing if folks will go to partisan corners without including, you know, candidate names. If it's a third-party candidate, also trying to force a two-way is something I think we're thinking a lot about. Did people, you know, sort of these, if it's not that they were, if they were in the sample, did they hide? Did they, you know, hide in an undecided place or in a third party? Not necessarily because they thought that was, they weren't being honest, but they were seriously considering those things, and that's where they were leaning at the time. So what if it's a two-way without that third option? So those are some things that we've been kicking around and are excited to put into practice.
And midterms are going to have different turnout challenges than
absolutely.
presidential. I have to go, so I apologize for having a bolt. Thank you, everybody, all 700 friends. Hello, everybody, and talk to everybody soon. Thank you for having me.
All right, last word to Ben. Go for it. What are the lessons you're taking away?
Yeah, I mean, I think Carlos kind of hit the nail on the head in terms of like being like a little bit more intentional about presentation and interpretation in terms of how we're thinking about this stuff, and understanding that like sometimes there are some pretty big error bands that we're dealing with, and being able to be creative and imaginative about what the data set that's in front of us could mean. And then also just like, you know, being maybe a little bit more aggressive in gaming out some scenarios. I mean, we saw pretty consistently this cycle that Democrats were getting what Democrats were getting, and that there was some softness in the Republican number. And so maybe, you know, we need to come up with some innovative solutions for allocating undecided voters, or pushing soft supporters into a direction that's more meaningful to kind of get rid of some of the uncertainty that comes from having undecided voters in polls. And I think in some ways that will also help like the consumer of polling information be able to consume it in a more meaningful and in a way that actually kind of tells the story a little bit better. So, you know, that and then everything else that folks have been talking about, right? We got to continue to innovate. We've got to continue to figure out new ways to reach people, but not take for granted what we learned this time, right? We're now sitting on this trove of data. We have all of these polls that we just did, and we have all of these electoral outcomes that we can compare these polls to. Like we can start to figure out some patterns, and you know, there's lots of sophisticated tools that are now out there for modeling this stuff. And I will say one of the, you know, to go back to the first panel, like it does seem like the analytics were actually quite accurate from just anecdotally from what I've heard from a lot of practitioners and clients, is that like the modeling this cycle was actually quite good. And so maybe figuring out new ways for us to integrate our public opinion research, the smaller sample stuff that we're doing with the bigger data analytics, that's based on just a lot more information. It's based on the full voter file and consumer data footprint that voters have. That's based on much larger samples of surveys. So just finding ways to increase stability in the estimates that we're producing and that folks are using to make decisions.
All right, Ben Lazarus, Carlos Odio, Margie O'Mara, who we lost already, and Jane Rayburn. Thank you all for being here. Back to you, Tom.
Thank you so much. Thank you all. That was great. I appreciate the insight and introspection, and I look forward to seeing this conversation continue. So I'll also thank you to the folks who have put questions in the Q&A. We've gotten a bunch of them for the pollster panel. For those who are still around, feel free if you want to jump in there. I saw a lot of questions for y'all. Feel free to jump in with answers or follow-ups. So what I'm going to do is just take a few minutes here and share a little bit on what we know, what we don't know, and I am sharing now. And this is going to be real quick. If I had my way, we would just put a moratorium on any sort of post-election analysis and hot takes until about April of the following year, but I understand that's not how it works. So what we're going to do is just share a little bit on sort of what are the things that are out there, what evidence do we have that maybe supports some of these takes, what evidence do we have that maybe undermines some of them, and what's the process. So it's going to be quick. If folks have questions for me, I will be happy to take questions. We'll have a little bit of time for Q&A after I spend the next 5 minutes or so going through these slides. But I'm also happy to follow up after if anyone wants to have a longer conversation. So little data, big conclusions. There's not a lot of data, unfortunately. It's super frustrating, but you know, the polls close, and when the first polls closed on election night, even though we spent a lot of time talking about how we've got to wait, we've got to get it right, we've got to let all the votes counted, pretty immediately afterwards, people are already drawing conclusions. A lot of times those conclusions look like the things that they thought before the polls closed. And I'm probably as guilty of that as anyone, but I want to put some of this under the microscope. You know, the sort of data we have the exit polls, we've got slow vote counting, we've got county level data. That's about it. So some of the hot takes we saw out there, and this is not to criticize, this is again just because some of these, you know, seem to be supported by the data, some don't. But one, that youth turnout disappointed, that we saw lagging turnout among voters of color. We talked about swing to Trump among voters of color, you know, Biden underperforming in some key cities. We heard some of that. And then a lot about college educated white voters in the suburbs, and that the notion that that was largely what we were seeing there. So what's lacking in this analysis? So number one, and I say this all the time, but I'm going to say it again because we've got a great audience here. Exit polls are not made to gauge turnout. They're based on assumptions of turnout. I'm going to give you an example here in a state where we actually have the vote history. But I will tell you, you're going to see these errors all over the place. This isn't just the cherry picking of one state. If you look at Georgia and you look at the exit polls, they suggested that voters age 18 to 29 accounted for 20% of the electorate. They were actually 17% of the electorate. Now, 3-point difference in share doesn't seem huge, but when that's a group that's better than 2-to-1 Democratic, it's problematic. Even more so, seniors. The exit polls suggested that seniors were only 19% of the electorate in Georgia. They ended up being 26% of the electorate. And again, this is not to call out the people who do the exit polls. This is a very difficult task, just like any other poll. In the end, you have to weight it to a certain level, and they don't have the vote history yet. So I offer that not as a criticism of the exit polls, but rather as a criticism of using exit polls to draw conclusions about turnout. Other problems, when we look at the county level results mask a lot of trends that are happening at the sub-county level. Number one, a lot of these groups aren't monolithic. So we might look at it and say, well, this is a county and there's a lot of college educated white voters, and we saw this change in support swinging towards Biden. Does that mean it was the same people who voted in 2016? Or was it a difference? Carlos talked about this with Latino voters. Question of, did we see more Republican Latino voters who didn't turn out in 16 come out in 20? At the county level, you can't possibly answer that question. And then finally, pandemic effect. Great example of that would be looking at Pennsylvania. If you look at the 3 counties in Pennsylvania that had the smallest surge in turnout, because every single county in Pennsylvania had higher turnout in terms of raw votes than 2016, but the 3 slowest surging or smallest surges came in Philadelphia, Centre County, and Indiana County. One thing that all 3 of those have in common, they have a whole lot of university students. Well, a lot of those university students weren't at the university. So was it that the youth vote disappointed? Well, as you'll see in the data I'm going to share in a minute, not likely. It just meant that it dissipated to other counties. So comparing at the county level is less than perfect. And then the last part, again, it takes a while to count these votes. If you're drawing conclusions in the first few days after the election, there's a significant potential that you just might be wrong when all the votes are counted, especially in the slower counting places. So let's take on a couple of these conclusions head on. Youth turnout disappointed, voters of color lagged. The reality, in the 6 states, and again, this is only applicable to these 6 states, but certainly a promising trend across these 6 states, and you can see the states on the slide here. In all 6 of these states, when we look at the individual data, so this isn't a poll, this is actual individual level vote history where we know the age. In all 6 of them, voters under the age of 30 actually occupied a larger share of the electorate than they did in 2016. Meaning, look, everyone's turnout surged, but voters under the age of 30 had a bigger surge than any other age group. The other end, seniors also surged, but younger voters occupied a larger share of the electorate. Second, increased their share of the electorate in every single state where we have vote history. So those are 2 early hot takes that, you know, right at this point, the evidence is suggesting that didn't happen. One thing I have to call out here, turnout among AAPI voters. If you follow me on Twitter, you know I talk about this a lot. It's only because the numbers are so stunning. Asian American Pacific Islander voters, we saw this in the early vote where they were surpassing their election day turnout, their total turnout from 2016 just in the early vote. In Georgia, they increased overall their turnout by 91%. In Texas, almost doubled their turnout. I certainly encourage those of you who are reporting on the story of this election to look closer at that. I've had the pleasure of talking with a lot of these groups who did really incredible organizing work, and I think that's a story that just hasn't been told enough at this point. Next part, Latino voters swinging to Trump. Well, you know, a lot of this is undeniable. When you look at the top 20 counties that had the biggest margin swing from Democrats to Republicans, 19 of the top 20 are in the Rio Grande Valley. The other one of that 20 is Miami-Dade County. So it's not a surprise. And Carlos Odio alluded to this in the last panel. Some of these hot takes suffer from the earliest data coming in. That was the first data we saw, was Miami-Dade, and everyone was focusing on the big drop off there. And then in Texas and the Rio Grande Valley, those are some of the most surprising results. So it's not to say that those results didn't happen. It's that we focused on those where it was the most significant, where in the other areas, there's certainly evidence of a swing towards Trump, but smaller. And that has to be part of the analysis. And even in these areas where it was most significant, I'm going to give you an example in Maverick County, Texas. I talk about it a lot because it's fascinating to me. The first time I paid attention to Maverick County, Texas was in 2008. Because if you looked at the counties ranked nationally by those that swung most from Democrat to Republican, the ones that had the biggest Democratic gain, Maverick County was #1. And this year it was #2 towards Republicans. Now, if you look at this history for Maverick County, this is a Rio Grande Valley county that is almost homogenous Latino county. And you look at the swing and you see Democrats do worst when Republican incumbents are running for re-election. Democrats do best when they are incumbents running for re-election themselves or in Democratic open seats like in 2016. And you look at that history, part of this suggests that a big part of the swing was an incumbency advantage that bears more weight in this community. Does that mean that's the only answer? No. Is that an excuse and mean we don't need to invest more resources? Absolutely not. But if we're looking at this as a hot take and thinking about the impact of issues like defund the police or socialism, well, we have to take it in the context of what we've seen historically and acknowledge that this sort of trend has been happening for a while. And again, I won't deny that it was certainly more pronounced in 2020. I will note, as you see on the slide here, that although Joe Biden only won Maverick County by 10 points, our Democratic Senate candidate, N.J. Hager, won it by 16 points, which is very close to where we were in 2004 and in line with that Republican incumbent re-election number in that county. Okay, just a couple more things here, and I apologize for going fast, but I want to make sure we have time for questions, and y'all have been on for a while. So the question of whether or not African-American voters swung to Trump and sort of where this was drawn from, the notion that Biden underperformed in key cities. Well, this is one that really suffered a lot from the cities counting slowly. The cities that we heard a lot about in a couple days after election night were Philly, Detroit, and Milwaukee, because the counts there initially showed that turnout in all of those places was significantly lower than 2016, and that Biden was doing worse than Secretary Clinton did. When all the votes were counted, we can universally say that Biden actually won more votes than Clinton in all three of these cities. The turnout was higher, and yes, there was an increase for Trump, and it varied. You know, in Milwaukee, it was a very minimal increase, 3,000 votes. in Detroit, 6,000 votes. In Philadelphia, larger, 25,000 votes. But can we look at that and conclude that that gain came just because African-American voters were crossing over? No, it was likely a combination of a handful of factors. There are white conservative areas of these cities. There are Latino voters where we have seen more of that swing. There are other factors at play. So we really need to dig into the individual data before we draw any of these conclusions conclusively. And the last point I want to touch on, and then again, I'll be happy to take some questions if you want to put them in the Q&A box. There's been a lot of talk about college-educated white voters, and in a lot of ways, suburbs has become sort of shorthand for college-educated white voter. And while there are certainly a lot of those voters in these suburbs, and there's certainly great evidence that a large number of these voters have swung over the last 4 years, whether or not that tells the whole story, I'm skeptical. The evidence that we have at this point suggests that the suburban swing was, yes, about persuasion successes with these white college-educated voters, but it was also about diversifying the coalition there. It was about higher support from AAPI voters and Latino voters in some of these communities, high turnout from African-American voters, Latino voters, AAPI voters, as well as those turnout surges from white college-educated Dems who maybe didn't come out in 2016, but did come out in 2018. And then, yes, some white college-educated Dems who likely supported President Trump in 2016 and crossed over. And again, we'll really need to dig into the individual data to answer that question, but I want to leave you with a few counties as evidence of this. The #1 county in terms of margin swing nationally, the county that swung the most from Republicans to Democrats when you look at the margin between 2016 and 2020 was Henry County, Georgia. So Henry County is one of these counties. It's Atlanta Metro, but it's not the close-in larger suburbs. It's one of the slightly further out suburbs. And you look at what happened, and the comparison here is from 2016, 2018, and 2020. What you see is the African-American vote share there increased massively, 7 points. For a group that's giving 90% plus support, that's a huge part of it. What happened with the white vote? White college-educated vote was largely flat, and the white non-college vote dropped as a share by 9 points. The Latino vote increased from 2% to 2.7%. So again, there were a lot of factors at play, but when you look at this and say the suburban swing in Georgia was due to white college-educated voters, you're ignoring some really important demographic trends and frankly, just important organizing successes among communities of color. I'm gonna give you just 2 more quick examples, and then I'll take questions. Rockdale County was the #2 biggest swing nationally. 7 of the biggest 20 county swings came in Georgia, by the way. Same pattern, African-American voters, 6.8% share increase. The white non-college share dropped by 8 points. API increased, Latino vote increased. And then finally, Gwinnett County, obviously a larger county, but similar trends. The African-American vote increased over 2016 by 2 points. Here you had a doubling of the AAPI vote in terms of raw numbers, in terms of share increase of almost 4 points, just really striking numbers. The white college share actually dropped there, 1.5 points, and the white non-college dropped as well. The Latino vote increased by 2.2 points. So again, what happened in Gwinnett County? Certainly there were white college-educated voters who swung from Trump to Biden, but a huge part of this story was just the fact that these suburbs are more diverse and the organizing successes and just getting massive turnout numbers from these communities of color. So in conclusion, what's next? We're working on compiling the vote history for every voter, every state in the country. I have to give a shout out to our team. They are incredible. They don't slow down, and they are doing this work. They just shift from doing the election work into now collecting all the voter data, appending it to our voter files so we can look at the demographic trends and answering a lot of these key questions. So I do hope that we will be able to bring your attention back to these questions early next year as we have more data to share as part of this important conversation. So I'm going to stop this share here. And I know I went a bit over, actually more than a bit over. When I get talking about these things, I can't stop. I'd be happy to take a few questions. And then again, if folks have any follow-up, I'm happy to follow up offline.
Great. Tom, so we have a few participants asking about drilling down a bit more into voters of color. Can you share any analysis on how the increase in Black, Latino, and AAPI voters compared to the white voter increase?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And again, I hesitate to draw any conclusions to follow my own advice and my own admonition at the outset of this. I can only speak to what we've seen at this point in the 6 states where we have full vote history. And those are diverse states and different states in a lot of ways, but this could change. But in speaking to those states, Georgia, Colorado, Nevada, Oregon, Washington, Montana, like I said, in each of them, look at voters of color, their turnout surged. Turnout surged among every demographic, right? We set record levels for turnout. So it wasn't a question of some group dropping in turnout, but they did drop in vote share, groups that didn't keep up with those surges. And the largest surges we saw nationally, #1 among Asian American Pacific Islander voters. And then in terms of Latino voters, and you know, part of this is just growth in these communities and 2 of the largest immigrant communities in this country. Another factor in this is youth. Latino voters and API voters are younger on average, and we saw this massive youth surge. But then again, a much bigger part of this was just the organizing successes, and I think there are stories that are left to be told there. So those votes surged. African-American vote in all 6 of those states surged above and beyond the increases in the white vote. You know, something that strikes me about Georgia when we think about the historic victory for Biden and Harris in Georgia is the fact that the electorate there is decisively the most diverse electorate they've had in Georgia. The white vote share was lower than it's ever been. That sort of result doesn't happen without that sort of surge in turnout among voters of color.
Great. And then next, we have a few questions on Georgia. So first, a question about your thoughts and insights on the 2 counties in Georgia that voted Biden-Perdue, and a second on whether or not Democrats can win.
Yeah, those are 2 fantastic questions, and I wish I knew the answer. To the first question, the difference, and there was a difference, and I would even expand it beyond. You know, sometimes we focus on the counties that are closest to the tipping point, and that's not always where you've seen the biggest divergence. You know, sometimes there might be a county where Biden was at 40%, and our Democratic Senate candidates were at 20%, and you're not going to see anything that big, but you get my point. So we're focusing on all those counties. That's actually the next level of analysis that we're engaging in at this point, is to look at exactly those crossover votes to see if there are demographic predictors. So at this point, I'd hesitate to share any findings because it's early, but I will say that's something that we're looking at, and that's a key component to the second question in terms of how things are looking. I'm going to state the obvious here. You know, the fact that Joe Biden won the state shows that it's winnable for the Democrats. But that said, you know, there is a trend happening in Georgia. It's a fairly steady trend, the likes of which we've seen in the Mid-Atlantic from Virginia. We've seen it in North Carolina to differing degrees. We are seeing it in Georgia now as it becomes more diverse and as those college-educated white voters become better for Democrats. So that said, the presidential election showed a big leap forward to that extent. Georgia is by no means a Democratic state just because of that one election. This will be competitive. Both of these races will be competitive. And in the end, it'll be decided by which party can get more of a larger share of their voters who came out in the presidential election to come back out in a January 5th election, which is a tough thing. I mean, these runoffs were created with the notion of suppressing turnout among voters of color. That's just undeniable. And so that said, you look at the organizing that's happening on our side, both on the candidate side, the hard side, the party side, and then groups like Fair Fight and other great groups among these different communities. And you have to feel optimistic about Democrats' chances.
Thanks, Tom. And then we have a question about the lack of coattails. So Democrats who lost in state legislative or congressional districts that Biden won. And do you think that reflects ballot roll-offs or ticket splitting or both? Curious on your thoughts.
Yeah, you know, that's a curious question because sort of at the top level, we look at this and we say, well, Biden won, but Democrats lost seats. Therefore, Biden must have lacked coattails. But realistically, and this is where we'll really have to look at a district level below analysis. And some people have begun to do this. And I think they've done a good job. Realistically, we look at this, and in 2018, Democrats picked up a lot of House seats where Republicans who turned out in 16 stayed home. And there was just this significant turnout advantage. As has been mentioned in the previous two panels, that turnout advantage, even though Democratic turnout was massive, there wasn't as much of a disparity, it seems, at this point. And Republicans did come out with Trump back on the ballot. And so there wasn't necessarily a persuasion advantage or a change in the voters. There was a change in the electorate. But these were districts that Joe Biden didn't need to carry these states. So again, it appears as if there was this great bifurcation. But when you think of the gerrymandered nature of the House, and the fact that there are so many more House seats that lean Republican, I wouldn't be surprised as we continue this analysis to find that there wasn't as much of a disparity maybe as the early results have suggested. We're talking about shifts in a lot of cases of just a few points. And again, not to say that those shifts aren't important, don't need to be assessed, but maybe they're not as substantial as they looked at first blush. So I know we've run a bit long here, and I do appreciate these questions. What I'd suggest now is that we'll wrap up, and if folks, we will keep this open just for a little bit. If folks have additional questions or they want any follow-up, please feel free to put it in the Q&A, and we will circle back. I want to thank, first of all of our panelists who just did an excellent job, and Reed Wilson, who moderated the second panel. I want to thank you all for coming, and I want to take this rare point of privilege because I noticed my mom was in the audience. I think this is the first time that my mom's actually been able to see one of these presentations. So I've always wanted to say this. Hi, Mom. Thanks, everybody. Look forward to seeing you all in person sometime soon. Please stay safe and take care.